So I wanted to spend today on kind of the theoretical underpinnings of communism. For those of you who took the intro class, which I kind of think is almost all of you, it'll be a bit of review, but necessary review, so that because lots of times, when we use the terms communism and socialism today, they do mean different things. Like I pointed out before, they didn't always mean different things. People weren't always so clear about delineating the difference between the two. But they do mean different things now. So you have to understand what communism is in order to be able to differentiate it effectively from socialism and to evaluate the two. So you probably already know that one of the major influences on Karl Marx was Hegel, right? Hegel wrote many things, but among them were works on philosophy of history, the idea of history as having embedded truth within it, or a sort of argument within it. And these are arguments that Hegel, or that Marx picked up on and used and changed. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but just to kind of hit the highlights. For Hegel, human history was driven by this desire for recognition, which he said is basically more or less an instinctual desire on the part of human beings. And he said no other beast, although one could argue there are a few other beasts, like chimpanzees or other animals that have the sort of alpha type attitude and fight over prestige or power, that they might share this. But Hegel said, this is what makes human beings different, is we're the beast with red cheeks. We can become insulted and we can blush even over something that maybe an animal wouldn't even recognize as a threat, right? Remember the recent Republican debate where, not to mention the specifics, but where these guys got into more or less a chest-puffing, kissing contest. And there was a lot of sort of, jockeying, right? And not a whole lot of content. I suppose Hegel would say animals would have, even if they could somehow understand the language, they certainly wouldn't understand what the point was to all that. And maybe there shouldn't have been a point, but the point was, which one of these was truly influential, which one of these guys was powerful, right? Who should people listen to? And they got down to a pretty primitive level at that point. So for Hegel, this is a sense of pride, okay? And it can lead to debacles like that where, people embarrass themselves. It can also lead to wars. It can lead to all sorts of conflict. And we generally look at pride as a sort of sin because of that. It's one of the 7 deadly sins, isn't it? A source of conflict, problems, and so forth. Hegel didn't quite see it the same way. Yes, it drives conflict, but because he looked at history differently, he saw pride as a source of driving history towards some outcomes that were actually good. Okay? Now, it's because of this desire for recognition that ultimately the outcome is good. Okay? Or at least that's the way he saw it. Okay? We want to be seen as valuable by other people. We want to be recognized by other human beings as equally valuable, dignified. Okay? And if we have to, we'll force them to do that. And that's what most of human history has been about in Hegel's view, is if you can't extract the respect through political means, through sort of human means or rational means, you use the beast, right, as Machiavelli said, and you use force. And so you have a war, or you have an uprising or a rebellion or a civil war, right, where people demand this recognition. Notice that this is not about money, okay, for Hegel. Yeah, money plays a part in making people powerful, but this is about power. It's about recognition. Right? And so Hegel starts out with the idea that the original, governmental organization or way that people ordered themselves was the master-slave relationship. Okay? And that's because some people basically got the advantage of other people through the use of physical force. He makes a sort of almost weirdly moral point about it by saying that those who submitted did not have as much courage as those who used their power to force other people to submit. Okay? But in the long run, those master-slave relationships of ancient Greece, right, for instance, and that's where he would have been drawing from, they did not represent the reality of human nature. Okay? They sort of falsified human nature by treating some people like things and other people like human beings. Okay? So the people who were treated like things, the slaves, understood their own humanity and waited their time. And this happens over and over again in history. They wait and they bide their time until there's an opportunity to demand, through the use of force typically, some fixing of that inequality. And this is called the dialectical process of history. There's conflict, there's a new outcome that changes people's status somewhat, but that changes in status is included, for instance, in the United States, we moved from master-slave society in the South to a society in which people were technically free, but some were much more equal than others. Right? And some were still treated as hardly even citizens at all. And so then we had the civil rights movement, and this moved, people towards more equality. But still, even to this day, there's not full political or economic equality. So there's this ongoing process. And it's leading in a particular direction from Hegel's point of view. Okay? So the historical dialectic from this point of view is leading towards a form of equality that's probably, and I say probably because Hegel's hard to interpret and people have interpreted his views differently, but is probably leading to some sort of liberal system. And the reason why I say that is because what drives it is recognition and not property, okay? Not material things, but you might say spiritual things. And Hegel was fond of using the term spirit to describe what it was that motivated people to fight these battles, okay? So if that's true, then Hegel's dialectic ends in something like equality under the law. Okay? And I used a term there that's significant for Hegel and also for Marx, and which was taken up later by other people to champion the idea of the triumph of democracy, but the end of history. Meaning that history is kind of teleological. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And all of it is leading towards that end, that ultimate outcome. Not that events are going to stop, but rather that we are heading towards an optimal result where people finally get what they want, right? Which for Hegel was probably something like constitutional government with representation, rights, democratic participation of sorts, okay? All right? So, that's sort of the, if you want to know where I'm kind of drawing from, that's the Kojève interpretation of Hegel. Anyway, at any rate, Hegel was not Marx. This much we know. But Marx liked the idea of dialectic, because he too could see that history was, as Hegel put it, a slaughter bench. That history was all about conflict. And that human beings often fought not just for the mere subsistence, but for more than that. That over land, okay, over things. And so Marx takes this idea of dialectical history and he brings materialism into it. And the conflict becomes not about recognition in and of itself, which he labels as a sort of false consciousness, this idea that that equal recognition is enough is actually a sort of false consciousness. It's a mistaken notion of equality. And instead, he focuses upon material possessions, which create both equality and inequality. So what you see, he would say, is that those who have many more material possessions have much more de facto recognition. Okay? And as long as that inequality exists in things, it won't mean very much, because material things equal power in our societies. Okay? This is why Marx saw history as a struggle among economic classes. So class, economic class, looms really large in Marx's analysis, whereas for Hegel, not so. Yes, there were groups of people fighting for equal recognition, but it didn't necessarily, in his mind, break down according to economic class. All right? So this is how Marx sort of adopts Hegel's point of view, changes it, and uses it as part of his own historical analysis. All right. Marx taught that the most basic element in society, the thing that we look at to decide how we understand the class structure in the society and where the conflict is likely to come from, is in the means of production. So the most basic thing to look for are the forces of production. How are things made? What's the technology that's being used at the time? Okay. If we're in a sort of traditional agricultural society, right, of old, you're going to have pretty primitive tools, and you're going to have the need for a lot of manpower. Okay. And so you're much more likely to have slavery as a result of that. As tools improve and fewer people have to work on the land, there's less need for that. Right? And as other things are made, you need workers instead of slaves. So the society changes accordingly. And the political structure tends to change at the same time. So the political structure supports whatever the class structure is. It supports the people who own the means of production, the technology. Okay? In the old days, it was land, basically. Land gave you that power, land which you could then farm, right? In the American South, it was the huge plantations, right? Cotton plantations. There's nothing more labor-intensive than probably tobacco and cotton to be grown. And I know that because my dad worked on tobacco farms back in Kentucky. And it's like from start to finish, human beings are involved, and it's not fun work. So this is the insight that Marx brings here, that you look at the technology and everything else follows from that, right? And so you can understand, where the conflict is coming from, and you're going to be able to understand the government and why it exists and what it exists for. Okay? But you can also understand even the religion, the cultural values. All things are sort of to be understood through the lens of the means of production. So with me so far? Kind of ringing a bell as far as remembering? Okay. All right, so he then looked at, in capitalism, what do we have as far as relations of exchange? Well, we've got human relations based upon, paying people wages. Okay? And so that's a different way of thinking than we previously had about how resources are used and how people are compensated, you might say, right? We've already talked about this, but I will say this. These things are considered by Marx and Engels kind of, what would you say, sources of false consciousness, in as much as people think by looking at their government and their culture and their religion that they can find solutions to their problems. Like, for instance, if you're paid a wage and that wage isn't very good and you can barely make a living, okay, you might look to your government and the political process to solve the problem through political action. But Marx and Engels would say that's just going up the wrong alley. and gives the system cover as long as you use that. You might appeal to changing the culture, making people care more about this issue, changing the way things are made and what people buy, but he would also say that's a mistake. Or you might go to your religion for some sort of comfort and understanding of what's going on with you and how to put it in perspective. That also is a blind alley for him. Okay? So all of these things are part of the superstructure. They're all a part of false consciousness that blind people for a time from being able to see their exploitation. All right. So there comes times in history where things get bad enough that there's a chance for people to be able to see their exploitation instead of being blinded to it by sources of false consciousness. And Marx and Engels thought they were living during one of those times, during the Industrial Revolution, where people were lucky if they made a wage because many people were unemployed or barely made enough money to eke out a living. And it was just a rough time, and they could see people were organizing, unions were forming, people were revolting in some cases, trying to attempt to overthrow the system. They did things like take over factories and attempt to break the machinery. They felt that the machinery was sort of the enemy. Okay? So anyway, he was living during one of these times, and Marx and Engels saw the goal of the Communist Party as helping people break through the false consciousness, which they also said would eventually happen of its own course, right? Because the misery created by it would be so bad that they thought that it would automatically happen. But yet, they seem to exist in order to kind of speed up that process, to tell people what's happening and to make it happen in maybe a more rational way, okay? So they want to say you're a product of the system suffering from false consciousness, right? Both of those are very important. You are a product of a system. And I think that they thought most people had a real struggle just conceiving of themselves in that way. Right? People might have thought of themselves as Englishmen or Germans, or they might have thought of themselves as Catholics or Protestants or Jews. But they probably weren't seeing themselves primarily as members of an exploited economic class. And so this is what they needed to understand in their view. Any questions so far? Clarification? Okay. Yep.
Would this false consciousness kind of describe that as ignorance almost? It's more like ignorance of the ways of the world, or?
Well, they don't use that term, and I hesitate to attribute the idea to them because I will say, they looked at people in rural areas, okay? Here's just some textual evidence for no, they wouldn't say it was ignorant. They looked at people in rural areas as truly ignorant. They said that they were, in fact, suffering from idiocy because they were so traditionalist in their outlook on life, very religious, very, sort of wanting things to stay the same. And they differentiated those people from the people living in cities, the working class people, which they thought, had a lot of the tools that they needed to be able to see this, including having the experience of working socially in factories, of living together in close quarters. They might not be literate, which might be part of the problem, right? But the bigger part of the problem is that they literally don't have the time because they're so constantly trying to survive that they don't have the time to reflect about their situation without some sort of help. So if they explode, it's going to happen kind of as a force of nature, rather than a well thought out agenda. I think Marx and Engels thought that they could supply some of that, the Communist Party could supply some level of thought out agenda, but that explosion would happen out of this sheer frustration, out of immediate. So it's not, I would not, no, I don't think it would be ignorance that they would label that, because they were capable of calling people ignorant as well. So I mean, they didn't call the working class ignorant. Any other questions about related or unrelated? Yeah, so, I mean, they called workers in the capitalist system wage slaves, right? So they saw them as really oppressed to the point where, you know, they couldn't do this thinking that Marx and Engels could do. All right, so another aspect of their thought that we do have to review in order to understand the difference between socialism and communism has to do with a reaction to utopian socialists. We've talked about Moore, and we've talked about and your book also refers to all of these guys. Marx and Engels responded to utopian socialists like them as more or less well-meaning perhaps, but more or less dreaming or living in another world, or thinking that if only people were rational and could understand the vision, they would make things happen. They took an approach to change that wasn't realistic enough. And that kind of let them off the hook. They saw utopian socialists as more about making themselves feel good, if that makes sense, than about getting things changed. Okay? All right, so they also saw the rich, which many of those idealist socialists were, as trapped within the capitalist mentality, basically, or previous, mentality of those in power. They tended to see people as products of their environment, right? So even the wealthy oftentimes couldn't see beyond that, the blinders that they had. But obviously some did, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the contrast between medieval and capitalist society. They make a big point of this because the medieval or feudal system came prior to the capitalist system, and in some ways we see some major changes there that they pick up on. They call in the manifesto, they call the medieval values idyllic, somehow ideal, fanciful even, but in some way romantic as well. In fact, I think they use that term. Yeah, they do. Romantic in the sense of charming, right? And not because it wasn't exploitative, but because it gave people psychological means of interpreting what was happening in a positive way, in a way that gave meaning to it. Okay? So, for instance, in feudal times, inequality was seen as natural, and there were reasons that were given for this. Okay? The reasons had to do ultimately with God, right? So God was the source of aristocratic power, especially the power of the monarch. So that power was then connected up with the aristocracy and sort of legitimized, right? They were considered to be, through their inheritance of their genetics, right, as naturally superior, both intellectually and morally, okay, in character. And it may be surprising to you, but not just the wealthy believed that, but this was generally taught so that those who were in inferior positions could actually feel that they were a part of an overall good system, and that their role was not of their own making, that they weren't a serf because they were too stupid to be a lord, but this was their lot in life that they had been given by God, and that their duty, their moral duty, was to live that life out well in the display of their loyalty, let's say, to those above them. So this was a way of giving everybody in that system a sense that they served a purpose and that they had a sort of a moral position. And there was this notion, and Marx and Engels would probably say it was mainly fictitious, but there was this notion that all these different classes had moral duties and responsibilities to each other, right? So the lords had some moral responsibility to the serfs to provide for them and take care of them and care for them, and the serfs had responsibility to obey and respect and support their lords. Again, a lot of exceptions to those rules, and Marx and Engels would say this is largely rhetoric, perhaps, but their point is this is a narrative, to use Brueggemann's phrase. It's a narrative that was used it told the story about who we were so that everybody could feel like they were basically valuable. Okay? Chivalry, the idea of chivalry is a part of this, not just when it comes to relationships between men and women, but just generally the values of chivalry as in courage, bravery, caring for those who are weaker, as a moral framework, provided people with a sense of meaning. Religion, obviously, as well. And all of them supported this notion, which in a lot of cases in reality didn't work too well, but supported the notion that the strong were in their position because they should be, and that they should protect the weak, and the weak had more or less the expectation that they would, the moral expectation. Okay? Now, strangely enough, all of those romantic illusions caused people to be more comfortable and have less feelings of alienation in the feudal system because of this narrative, because of the story that they could tell themselves. Their expectations, which weren't always fulfilled. But this is the way the human mind works. If you give yourself a way of understanding, it becomes more acceptable. So we have here some of the benefits for psychology, or for our psychology for feudal society. Preservation of extended families. Both of the upper and of the lower classes, people tended to stay together. The serfs stayed on the land, right? Whether I suppose they had a choice or not is another matter. The wealthy, of course, owned the land and tended to stay in large extended families, which gave people a sense of belonging, family identity, on both sides, both the rich and the poor. We've already talked about respect for aristocracy as a natural order. The veneration of the monarch and the whole monarchy, which gave people a sense of pride that they could identify with the glory and grandeur of the monarchy, even if they were living in squalor. This was the symbolic head of their nation. Their religion, which also was a great sense of meaning for people, gave them, again, another way of feeling good about themselves, even in a less than perfect economic situation. Marx and Engels, of course, famously called religion the opiate of the masses because they said that it sort of dulled people more than anything else to their plight. They point out craftsmanship in the feudal times was a great source of pride. So the feudal craftsman could make an item, and he would take it from the raw materials which he either grew or raised or purchased, and he would take those raw materials and turn it into an item that he could go and sell himself. So he'd take it all the way from start to finish. It was his, okay, or hers, right? And so there was a great sense of pride that could be gotten from that craftsmanship. Which is truly extraordinary. A lot of knowledge goes into that, and the older you become, the better you are at those kind of skills, right? So this was something that was stripped from people. All of these things become taken away from people in capitalism. The seller and the buyer in the feudal system were direct relationships. Okay? So you'd go out into the marketplace with your produce or your cloth, right? Or your saddles or whatever it may be that you made, and you bargain directly with the buyer. You know what you have because you made it, and you know the other person who buys it personally. In a lot of cases, it encouraged personal relationships, and to the extent that local businesses, do this still, they can develop personal relationships. But think about the difference between that way of doing business and the current way. just to kind of, just take a step back and think about that a bit. How many merchants do you have a personal relationship with? And does that matter to you? Does anybody know anyone? It's just a difference. Okay? I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad difference, but it's definitely a difference. That the more capitalism developed, the less those types of relationships matter. And Marx and Engels are basically saying this is a humanizing element that you get in the feudal system that capitalism erodes. And it creates less community. Okay? All right. All right, so what happens as capitalism proceeds and we get to the stage of the Industrial Revolution is that the workers begin to see that the superiority of those in power is not natural, like they thought during feudal times. It has nothing to do with their blood or their genetics or their connection with God, but simply has to do with how much money they have. And this becomes very clear and unmistakable. That the guy, for instance, Donald Trump, why is he running for president? He's a billionaire. So he doesn't need any more of a reason than that, right? So what that does is that equalizes me and Trump in a way, you see. I can say, yes, he can run for president if he wants to, but the only difference between me and him is that he's got a lot more money than I do. Okay? Some people say he has more business know-how too, but we could even grant that. But I'd still feel relatively equal to him as a human being. I don't think he's got some sort of genetic superiority to me. He doesn't have a direct line to God, right? Okay, hopefully we won't argue about that, but I expressed my opinion there, I guess. But so anyway, basically the veil is torn from people's eyes in this taking away the feudal idyllic illusions. You get something called class consciousness. Okay? You're able to see that the exploitation occurs, or the inequality occurs, whatever you want to call it, because some people have more money and more property than other people. Now the capitalists would say, well, that's because what? What would capitalists argue back as far as why there's economic inequality? Yeah, they would say, well, I got that property by working hard. Yeah, working hard, planning, using every resource I have, being good at it, right? And so therefore, since I put that in, it's not like aristocracy where I was just born with it. I made it, right? That's the difference between the aristocrats and the bourgeois. The bourgeois class made their money. And so why should I care, if other people don't have that? And furthermore, and this was an argument that was frequently made, because I have this and I'm wealthier, I should have more political power because I'm paying more taxes and I'm of more influence in this society. I have more to lose, right? I employ a lot of other people, so heck yeah, I should have more influence. So that's kind of the response. Okay? But Marx and Engels don't think that these types of arguments are good enough justification. They do tend to think that some of these things happen by chance, some happen by corruption, that if things were more equal from the start, you wouldn't end up with these great inequalities. Okay? So anyway, we begin to get this dissatisfaction in labor, this notion that there's no control over your life, that you have to go to work every day because otherwise you can't survive, that when you go to work in one of these huge factories like Engels' textile factories, you're just a cog in a big machine. Which truly, if you Google, what some of these factories look like, you would have to say, yeah, people were pretty much cogs in the machine, and they were replaceable if the machinery didn't need them anymore. So because of all this, capitalism creates a feeling of desperation or misery that pushes people who are naturally kind of conservative, as Oakeshott said. They naturally, Locke made the same point. They will hang on to the status quo if they possibly can, but there comes a point where they cannot anymore. And so the value of capitalism, one of the values of capitalism for Marx and Engels, is that it produces such a level of desperation for so many people, because in capitalism you don't have multiple classes, you have this vast, huge underclass that's the vast majority of people, which is an unprecedented event in their view in human history, to have the vast majority of people be in this underclass. So it produces a level of desperation for a lot of people. And it also creates conditions that allow them to organize effectively. Okay? And this is something people don't talk about very often, but Marx and Engels had nothing against factories, and they didn't have anything at all against urbanization. They liked that because this brings people together and gives them the experience of their power of working together. Okay? They're in close quarters with each other. They can see the power of so-called social labor. And that power can be used in a way to benefit them instead of benefiting the capitalist. Okay? So class consciousness emerges at the same time that people can see the value of the new technology. The capitalist technology is good. The capitalist means of using it is not. Okay? So the goal of the communists is to take that technology and use it effectively for the benefit of society as a whole. And to do that, they have to have a revolution, because you cannot expect the capitalists to give away their things. You're going to have to take it from them. So the vision is not to get rid of factories, but to have worker-controlled factories, factories that are used efficiently, they would say, for the first time for social benefit. It's not very efficient when you're producing things that, again, Marx and Engels would say, the working class can't buy because you're not paying them enough to buy them. In what way is that efficient? They thought capitalism didn't make a whole lot of logical sense. And so what makes more sense is you use the mass production technology to create for the masses. All right, so I think I've got a little bit left to say. I'm out of time, and I've got a little bit left to say about communism, and then we'll move into socialism, which emerged in and around the same time, or before that, but I mean as an argument against Marx and Engels and then Lenin around that time. All right.